MK Party Secretary General Floyd Shivambu says the most formations represented in the KwaZulu-Natal have given the nod for a new government to be formed. The province is currently run by a coalition consisting of the IFP, ANC, Democratic Alliance and the National Freedom Party. Shivambu says talks are already underway.
And there are political parties, all of them, that are in the legislature of KwaZulu-Natal now that want to, of course, constitute government with Mkhonto weSizwe. They accept the Democratic Alliance. All the other political parties that are in the legislature of KwaZulu-Natal have expressed interest directly, indirectly, sometimes with or without mandate, to constitute government with Mkhonto weSizwe. We are still having an internal political discussion as to how do we constitute such a government so that it's a responsible, responsive and decisive government which is going to improve the lives of our people. So the issue of constituting government here in KwaZulu-Natal is going to happen. It's the issue of when do we do it as Mkhonto weSizwe in a manner that is much more sustainable and does not get to compromise the livelihoods of our people.
Let's stay with the MK Party. Shivambu says the party has an extensive 2025 program which will allegedly expose how May's elections were rigged. The party has repeatedly made this claim without providing any proof.
The program for 2025 will also include the organic and public launches of Mkhonto weSizwe Women's League, Mkhonto weSizwe Youth League, and Mkhonto weSizwe Students Movement. The program for 2025 will also include a week-long policy conference to consolidate our policy positions and agenda for change and radical economic transformation. And our program for 2025 will include the systematic and systemic revealing to the people of South Africa on how elections were rigged against Mkhonto weSizwe Party.
All right, let's try and tie up all of these political events that are taking place this week. And to help us do that, you remember the EFF is scheduled to hold what it calls the National People's Assembly. Simply put, it's an elective conference where they're going to elect a new leadership. That also starts this week. Let's speak now to political analyst Asanda Ngoasheng. Ms. Ngoasheng, good evening to you and thank you very much for your time. Let's begin with the ANC SACP spat, if we can call it that. The SACP today putting it firmly that they are contesting the 2026 local government elections independent of the ANC, although they remain in an alliance with the African National Congress. How is that going to work?
Well, I think it's going to be very interesting. We've already seen how, you have in the Government of National Unity 10 political parties which are not necessarily ideologically aligned, and how they've kind of tried to find their feet and come together as alliance partners effectively. And so that could be a model that they could look at. But I also think it's ill-advised at this point to an extent for the SACP to contest elections on their own, because you essentially are having a situation where Black people essentially, the interests of Black people are being broken into many, many, many pieces, such that may have the potential of strengthening the interests of white people, which are under the DA, the Freedom Front Plus, and a few other political parties. And so it's going to be interesting to see how the SACP is going to bring something different and something new, particularly because although within the ANC, they have, I think, to an extent been good at ensuring that we are not, as a country, fully under capitalism. There are some socialistic tendencies towards, in terms of our economic system. They also have failed in some ways to lead on economic ideology conversations. I was expecting, or would be expecting, the SACP to have some strong conversations about illegal mining, about artisanal mining, about the spaza shop industry and what's happening in that industry, because that industry itself exists as a sign, as a symptom of the fact that Black people continue to be left out of the economic system. Because if that wasn't the case, you wouldn't need a spaza shop, which was a product of apartheid. You wouldn't need a taxes system, which was a product of apartheid, excluding people from the public system, and you wouldn't need taverns, which are a product of the exclusion of Black people from the economy. So they should have led conversations about how do we engage Black people, how do we bring back Black people into the economy, such that we don't need these informal structures that are permanently going to kind of look like there is some progress, there is some engagement with the economy by Black people, but actually ultimately produce nothing, because they are not supported by the government or subsidized by the government in any way, while big retail is subsidized in a variety of ways, and big public transport, for instance, is publicly subsidized by the government in various ways. And so these are the conversations that SACP should have been leading. There's a lot of other conversations around the economy, around economic ideologies, that they should have been leading, that they failed. I listened to some of their people and they sound like, they're in the 80s, or they're in, some kind of smoky bar having Marxist conversations from a past era. They don't sound like people who are, or who have a handle on what it means to be South African right now, and what some of the economic issues that South Africans are facing, including, for instance, issues like, the gig economy, and the fact that we are having not only dealing with unemployment, but we're dealing with the fact that even those who are employed are not employed in the long term. It's gig economy. It's people who are living, from 3 months to 6 months to even a week-long contract. And the SACP, as people who are meant to be leading ideology on economic systems outside of capitalism, has failed in providing leadership on this. And that, to me, is really sad, because they had the potential to lead, particularly because by being part of government, by being an alliance partner, they had the voice, they had the power, and they had the necessary influence.
Let's test the popularity of these two ANC splinters, the MK Party and the EFF. The ANC saying, coming out of the recent by-elections, was in a way a test of popularity, particularly on the part of the MK Party, and they were happy that they essentially were far ahead of them. I think it was Fikile Mbalula who was saying this just a few days ago. As far as the EFF, they are still very much in contention, although they did fail to win a single ward in Limpopo at that by-election. What does that say about the popularity of these two ANC splinters?
Well, I think, one mistake that people make is to think that the people of Limpopo are going to support Julius Malema because he comes from there. And this is a big mistake, because if you understand Julius Malema's history, you will know that there's a bridge in Limpopo that stood for maybe about 5 or more years because his company, On Point, hadn't actually done its job. And so the most negatively affected people by Julius Malema's alleged corruption while he was still a member of the ANC was most felt by the people of Limpopo. So they are not going to support him. And that is why he doesn't get widespread, support within his own home province, because people have experienced the worst of him, unfortunately. And I think, while Julius Malema has managed to have a 10-year run under the EFF and really did challenge the ways in which the dominant political parties were engaging in politics, particularly the politics of blackness and the politics of racism and how it manifests itself in a post-1994 era, he has not, unfortunately, been able to move beyond the issues that he kind of started with. And I fear that he may not be able to grow further, considering that the Floyd Shivambus and others people who were quite heavily influential in terms of policy making in the EFF are no longer there. And already we see Julius Malema himself is somebody who's very difficult to kind of deal with and convince otherwise if he's not convinced about something. And so these are strong leaders that have left who had the potential to challenge him. And so the question is going to be now, who is going to be left in the party that can challenge him and that isn't basically in a way hero worshipping him as somebody who started this party. And then in terms of the MK, for me, it's really interesting how they really rely on South Africans' short-term memory in order to be able to get their wins. Because to me, it doesn't make sense how a man who was the president of this country, not just an ordinary member of society, but this man, Jacob Zuma, has been a member of cabinet in South Africa since post 1994. He has never been an ordinary citizen of South Africa. And he even went as far as the highest office, being the president of the biggest political party at the time in South Africa, the African National Congress. And he somehow is convincing people that there are things that he couldn't do as president that he suddenly is going to be able to do as kind of an influencer in a much smaller party with a much kind of higher hurdle of an influence. And so it's very interesting also to see how that political party, the MK, has become the army or the band of the alleged corrupting forces. And these are the people who we have, from state capture, accusation after accusation of their involvement, of their taking money from the literal state fiscus. And now these are the people who are pushing and working very hard to come back into power so that, as far as I'm concerned, they can do what they did the last time because they got away with it and they have never been held under any kind of accountability for their actions. And I think in particular, July 2021 and the riots and the chaos that happened in KZN is one of the things that I think, Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC really failed us as a country on, because they should have been held accountable. And a lot of the people who are now members of the MK, who are now organizers of the MK, and who are now in the leadership of the MK are people who are alleged to be part of that riot. And so for as long as you have people who behave, who are allowed to be above the law, who behave and who are allowed to be reckless and do as they wish without any consequences, we are going to struggle to develop the kind of country that we want. And unfortunately, we're at a critical time as a country because it's been 30 years and it's been 30 years of ANC rule. And so we are entering that period now where, the apartheid seems for a lot of people to be very much in the past. And you've got people who are 30 years old who didn't live in apartheid. And so it is increasingly becoming a situation where a large chunk, the youth of your population, of your voting population, has no idea of apartheid and so isn't moved necessarily by conversations around needing to undo the legacy of apartheid and is more concerned about the present and the future. And the ANC has continuously been unable at this point, looking at their 40% win, they haven't been able to convince that. Julius Malema, to an extent, has been able to convince them, but I don't know if he necessarily will be able to continue to convince them, or if those people won't simply move over to the MK, or maybe even surprise us and move over to the SACP. So I think what's concerning me is that we are about to see a multitude of many small parties within our political system. And while the ANC deserves critique and deserves everything that's coming to it, it did provide us to an extent with some level of stability. And I'm not sure how much stability we're going to be able to have when we have this multitudity of political parties all vying for power. Already the last election, we're looking at 70 plus political parties that actually vied for it. In the coming election, both at a local government and national, you're likely to see even more people going for that power. And so it's going to be more and more difficult for South Africans to discern who is the best candidate for them, but also for them to be able to understand who is actually in power and how are they moving. If you look at a place like Nigeria, for instance, they even stopped kind of really using names and they just use a number because there are so many political parties. And that is the opposite, I think, of where we want to go, because although it provides for a diversity of opinions, there is a point at which you lose the stability that's required in the political system and you lose the coherence that is required for a government to be able to run and decisions to be able to make, as we've seen in municipalities where coalitions are chopping and changing every 6 months.
Asanda Ngoasheng, thank you very much for that analysis.